Hello, my name is Soul Zax. I'm a sculptor. I consider all artists culture soldiers, and I am one of them. As a culture soldier, I'm looking to change the way people perceive their world. And if you change the way people perceive their world, you'll change the way they act within it. Culture soldier is someone that is producing a body of work that changes the way people perceive what they are familiar with. One of the most profound things that culture soldiers can do is entertain, and through entertaining, educate. Through entertaining, tell people about things they did not know, tell people about a world they did not see. I feel education is really important. In fact, I don't see a difference between education and entertainment. Um, I feel that all the arts are an educational tool, and all the arts change the way in which change not only they change not only how, what kind of knowledge we have, but they also change the way in which we understand that knowledge, the way in which we use that knowledge. To me, some of the most profound culture soldiers were the bluesmen of the early 20th century. They started off with a culture that perceived them as clowns, as minstrels, as sambos. And somehow, through the dignity of their art, they were able to transform that into the modern rock and roll bluesman, the consummate hero of the 20th century, rather than a clown. I feel that culture has the ability to change an identity from something that is dismissed and, and hated to something that is embraced and um, celebrated. At the time when I was growing up in the late 70s and early 80s, um, neighborhoods like Bushwick or the South Bronx were supposed to be the worst, most horrible places you could be. And there was supposed to be nothing worthwhile about the people there or the culture there. But somehow, children from these neighborhoods with very little money, with very little education, very little resources, were able to produce a culture, a visual and musical culture that went around the world and was embraced by people all around the world without a gun or without schools. To me, this idea of these young men throwing up graph here and that graph 20 years later showing up in every city around the world, these young men and women stepping to the mic here or are scratching on some turntables. And this gesture, this creative expression, this sense of identity spreading from here to all around the world is a power that nobody can really understand or control. And that is what being a culture soldier is to me. A lot of my childhood experience with art was learning about European art and European art history, and learning how to render in perspectival space naturalistically like the European masters. It was also interesting that while I was studying things like that at Art Students League and at Saturday program at Cooper Union, I was also out in the streets doing graffiti and really studying street culture at the same time. And the interesting thing about street culture is that it's very African. Um, a lot of African American culture has never been academically digested. So it floats around in the streets of New York, in the streets of South Carolina, in the streets of Georgia, you know. Basically, street culture is the African retention of that African Americans made post-slavery. During the 19th century, the European Academy spent a great deal of time dismissing African culture as not being an academically valuable culture. So, so you had statements like fetishes were applied to African art. Nobody would call the Madonna a fetish, but nonetheless, in African art, an Nkisi became called a fetish. And this word fetish is an academic way of dismissing the intellectual property, the sacredness, the concepts behind an image. I specifically make constant references to West and Central African culture and show how they're reflected in African American culture so that people who are familiar with African American culture can now have a window into the African cultures that they may not be as familiar with. One of the things that I really love to celebrate is the way in which African Americans have confronted and overcome oppression. When you consider the fact that Africans were under such horrible duress here for so many centuries, and for the most part, I mean, of course there were violent uprisings, but for the most part, non-violently and through cultural weapons like music, dance, art, we've changed the way our oppressive culture have seen us. And by being politically active, have actually changed the government to recognize us as equal citizens. And we've done that for the most part non-violently. We've done that through the power of the word, through the power of our expression, through the power of a communal understanding of what it means to be human. And to me, Juneteenth is a celebration of that kind of struggle. Juneteenth, for those who don't know, is an African-American holiday that celebrates when the last slaves were finally freed at the end of the Civil War from radical plantation owners that still wanted to hold on to their slaves even after the war. And when these slaves were finally freed, that to me was the beginning of our cultural fight for freedom. Not the end of our cultural fight for freedom, but the beginning. It was the acknowledgement of our country that they had made a horrible mistake, and they paid for that mistake with blood, with such a violent internal war. From then on, though, we fought the country through social activity, through cultural activity, and have been incredibly successful in changing our horribly racist culture into being much more equitable. Of course, there's still things that we have to struggle for, but nonetheless, I celebrate every Juneteenth the cultural strategies used by our ancestors to non-violently overcome a very violent racist regime. Usually I pick out a specific cultural theme that I feel is important, has been important towards movement towards social equity. My first Juneteenth was called a merry kinship, and it was this idea that regardless of our races, we are one kin on one ship, and it is up to us to work to have happiness, and that happiness happens through unity and through an acknowledge of a family relationship between many different culture soldiers. So for my first show, I invited all types of people to come in and produce work that celebrated the means by which we confront oppression and racism as a people, not just as African American people. And this latest Juneteenth was a celebration of medicine from heaven, the idea that by using our cultural knowledge from our ancestors, we can go ahead and proceed to fight for social equity that has yet to be gained.
The exhibition we have up this evening is Soul Sax's Medicine from Heaven, how African American culture cured the USA. Soul Sax will be conducting a workshop, an Orisha-inspired workshop this afternoon, and we look forward to having you see that.
One thing that makes me very sad is the historic resistance of many African Americans and many Americans in general to African culture. This idea that African culture is evil, that voodoo is something that is of the devil, was a prevalent idea in the 20th century. Artists like Zora Neale Hurston, she was completely reviled by her own community, even after being a hero of the Harlem Renaissance. When she came back from Haiti and became a advocate for voodoo and voodoo culture of Haiti. Um, it was tragic. The community turned their backs on her, called her a witch, and she died penniless. And it wasn't until years later that Toni Morrison went and put an actual gravestone on her grave. Um, Zora Neale Hurston talked about the niggerarty and how the talented 10th percent have a resistance towards being too African because it would embarrass them in front of their Negrotarians, the European Americans that invest in African American culture. This idea that African Americans are primitive because they have these African retentions. To me, that is something that has been a central fight of my work, is to confront that idea and to recognize that no, African culture is not a primitive culture that is evil and should be dismissed, but in fact, it is the culture that produced the modern aesthetic. And so many of the motifs that we all consider modern and popular now, from music to dance to art, whether it be abstraction and improvisation, you could go down the line, isolations in dance, syncopation in music. All of these were specifically West and Central African aesthetic motifs that were dismissed in the 19th century as being primitive, but then in the 20th century became the modern popular aesthetic. And to me, as people of color, we have to Sankofa. We have to go back and get the valuable ancestral culture that was dismissed and reviled.
Hi, my name is Deborah Singletary, and I am the creator of Vision Carriers. I founded Vision Carriers to support people through significant life passages using the modalities of art, astrology, and dialogue. I founded Vision Carriers in 1986. I had been working with Vi Higginson with her production, Mama, I Want to Sing. And I was an administrator. And Mama, I Want to Sing really spoke to me because I thought the concept of singing had more to do with expressing our heart's desire than it did with just singing. And here I was, an administrator, doing paperwork, working very long hours. And at some point, I began to make flowers on the memos. And then I thought, this is not what I want to do with my life as much, even though I'm having a lot of fun as an administrator. And I realized that I was hiding my own artistic creativity by helping other people to be creative. So rather than take the risks of being creative myself, I would help other people be creative. And so then I took myself out of there and recreated myself as an artist. And then when I recreated myself as an artist, I realized that recreating yourself is difficult to do without support. And fortunately, I could support myself because I know how to do the paperwork, which is essential to moving a creative idea forward. And so my first instinct was to support artists by founding Vision Carriers. And I thought I would help them with their resumes and writing letters. But ultimately, I found that every single human being on this planet has a vision for their lives, and that very often they're afraid to articulate it and to live it, or perhaps they even know what they want to do, but they need help to move it along. And so I founded Vision Carriers to support people in also making the transition from one state to another state of being. In the beginning, they were primarily artists who wanted to further their art careers. But over time, my clients changed to be anybody who was going through some kind of life passage. For example, if somebody is struggling with leaving a job, how do you negotiate the feelings of fear? And how do you even negotiate the feelings of expectancy? And so I wanted to support people, and the way I supported them was very often by giving them astrology readings and helping them to see that the longing and the calling in their heart corresponded to the symbols on the chart, and I can offer them, in many cases, some assurance that this was the right path for them. All of us are artists when it comes to our lives. All of us are creating our own lives, and many times people don't realize that the life they're living this very day, to the extent that they love it, and to the extent that they hate it or are uncomfortable with it, it's the life that they created. And many times they're unconscious. I should say we are unconscious about what we're creating. And many times we're following someone else's idea of what we should be doing as a human being. I recently talked to a man who had wanted to be a painter, and a high school guidance counselor told him that he'd never make living, he'd never make money doing that. And so he squashed his desire. And so now it's many, many years since he left high school, but there was a soul in his hole. There was a hole in his soul. I wonder if there's some meaning in the other way I said it. But there was a hole in his soul that could only be filled by him finally facing his dream, the dream that he thought he was too old to do. And now it was time for him to do it. And so in that sense, it was through the dialogue and through astrology that I was able to be supportive to him. In 2004, I was ordained as an interfaith minister. And I remember after ordination thinking, okay, like, what am I going to do with this? And then I realized that I had always been doing ministry, that now I had paper that's and a connection with an ordaining body, but that I had always been a minister. But what becoming an ordained minister allowed me to do was also to marry people, which is really just a legal formality, as well as the creation of the ceremony itself. So I love creating ceremony. I think everything in life is a ceremony. Everything in life is a ritual. And I often will help people to create ceremonies and rituals that express and articulate something that they want to bring into being. I can remember when I was at the ordination ceremony, and I was told that the body of ministers being ordained, we were told that we were here to do service. And I thought, how the heck did I get into something else that's not going to make money? I thought, what have I done? Like, what, you know, how, what? You mean I got to do service? I'm already doing service. And the kind of service that I didn't necessarily enabled me to make a living financially. But I understand ministry to be that which connects one thing with the other thing to create a whole. And so in ministering to people, I'm essentially reminding them that they are whole. Ministry is service. And anything that we do is a ministry. The work that you're doing is, I would call that ministry. The work that a father does with his family, I call that ministry. The work that a waiter provides is ministry. And when you give unto others with the intention of being of service and not necessarily with an eye for what you'll get, then you're doing ministry. Around the time that I was ordained, maybe about a year before that, my father needed me to care for him. I had home health aides, but I devoted a lot of my time to him. And when I would get in a cab or take him to the hospital, people would say, "Oh, you're going to be blessed." And I thought, "Oh, I'm going to be blessed. I'm going to buy," I was like, "Oh, blessed. I'm going to hit the number." I thought of it in financial terms, like, oh, that would be the ultimate blessing. And then I looked around and I said, there are a lot of people who are helping people and they're not rich. And then it dawned on me that I wasn't going to be blessed. I was blessed. I was blessed with enough heart and patience and skill to make my father's last years comfortable and meaningful. So I provided a ministry to my father. And the blessing to me was that I got to do it. It wasn't in anything that I got except the joy of selfless service. One of the areas of life that I'm learning the most wisdom around is the energy of anger. And I'll tell you, as a woman with a temper, come step on my feet, and I can show you how quickly I might lose my temper, or would have in the past. But I have learned how to transform the energy of anger. And so I've developed a workshop called From Enrage to Outrage to Courage. And I use enrage to signify the energy of anger when it is unconscious and buried, and maybe we don't even know it's there. Sometimes people who are rageful, they're late all the time. Sometimes they're very, very nice. and then they overcommit and then they can't do it. There are all kinds of ways that we bury, or they have some kind of illness. There are all kinds of ways that people bury their anger, and I call that enrage. I call outrage the recognition that that anger is in there, and I'm going to bring it out and become conscious of it and meet it and look at it without judgment. And courage, and I love that the etymology of the word courage has rage in it, because it helps me to understand that rage isn't bad, like, let's get rid of all rage. No, we want to use it productively. Courage is made from the word C-O-U-R, which means heart. So courage is the ability for me to look into my heart for the source of my rage. When people take the rage child, they are often, while they are making it, they're having fun, but they're also remembering times when they were angry. However, they become less afraid. They have less of a need to project that anger onto someone else. And so it helps them in their interpersonal relationships, in their marriages, in their relationships at work, and in their relationships with their own children. Rather than give a lecture about rage, for example, I would rather have somebody do an art process to understand it. And so I have several workshops that are based upon spiritual principles. For one of them is the Word One workshop, where I get a pretty thick branch and we decorate it and then do a ceremony or a ritual with that wand. And the wand signifies that the words we speak are like messengers to the creative universe. And so I have people make a wand to serve as a reminder that their words have power.